All right. We're starting at page 112. It's the Transcendental Analytic. Chapter 2 of the Deduction of Pure Concepts of the Understanding. Section 1, Section 13. Of the Principles of a Transcendental Deduction in general. So my understanding, very briefly, which is probably incorrect and flawed, is, Kant has effectively presented a pretty persuasive way that our a priori understanding of experience is then translated into, we take the form and substance from that and are able to, digest it. And now he has to figure out how we then go to a system where he has put experience in one bucket in the transcendental aesthetic in those forms, and then he has a second bucket, which is the understanding, and now he has a bunch of logic that is supposedly all of the potential logical functions of the understanding, and then he has a bunch of categories that are presumably all the potential categories of the understanding, and now he is looking for our ability to a priori, or not our ability, but what underlies those things a priori, in particular, how we take experience and then funnel it through the logic and the understanding, and then actually know that we are coming out with some sort of legitimate understanding of reality. So, I don't know. Maybe that's gobbledygook, but that's my understanding of what he's going to try to do in the Transcendental Analytic. So yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot over the next, 70 pages, multiple sections. But yeah. Section 13 of the principles... Hold on, I gotta take my sweatshirt off. It's too hot. Okay, sorry. Jurists, when speaking of rights and claims, distinguish in a legal action the question of right, quid juris, from the question of fact, quid facti. And they demand proof of both. They call the first proof, which is to show the right or the legal claim, the deduction. Okay. I actually am an attorney. I don't think it's going to help me in understanding this very much, but I think what Kant is effectively saying here is they're in the law, and I mean, this is 18th century European law he's probably referring to, so, what I'm saying might not necessarily be super applicable, but, even in contemporary law, you essentially have questions of law and questions of fact. First, questions of fact are disputing what the actual, what actually happened in a case. And then if there are no disputes related to fact, or even if there are disputes related to fact, there is a legal question of whether or not there is any potential right or remedy that's available based on the undisputed facts. So I think that's kind of what he's getting here. The deduction is showing that you have a right to a legal claim. So the transcendental deduction would be showing a right to... transcendentalism? Anyway, we make use of a number of empirical concepts without opposition from anybody, and consider ourselves justified, without any deduction, to assign to them a sense or imagined meaning, because we can always appeal to experience to prove their objective reality. But there exists also concepts that we have usurped, such as fortune, fate, though allowed to circulate through an almost universal indulgence, are yet from time to time challenged by the question, quid juris? probably juris. I don't know. I didn't take Latin. I went to public school in the country. In this case, we are left in a great perplexity as to the deduction of these concepts. No clear legal title being available either from experience or from reason, on which the right to use them could be clearly established. Okay. So I think what he's saying is, like, there's a lot of things we kind of understand and experience based on, like, our empirical experience of the world, that it's, like, really easy to point to and be like, oh yeah, this is a keyboard. Like, it's a thing. I can hold it. Like, there it is. But there are also kind of more ethereal things like fortune, fate, that, you know, we would all agree are, I don't know about fortune and fate necessarily. Those might be bad examples, but like, chance, I guess. I don't know. Stuff like that, where it's like, we would all agree that they in fact exist, but you can't really touch them. You can't really experience them in the same way you can experience a sofa. Okay. Among the many concepts which form the complicated fabric of human knowledge, however, there are some which are marked out also for a priori use, completely independent of all experience, and their right to be so used requires at all times a deduction. So we're talking about concepts that are marked out also for a priori use, and their right to be used requires at all times a deduction. For proofs based on experience would not be sufficient to establish the legitimacy of such a use, yet it is necessary to know how these concepts can refer to objects, which they do not find in any experience. Okay, again, I think Kant is, like, he's getting at, like, we need to bridge this gap between concepts and experience and try to figure out how we do that. I'm going to reread that sentence. For proofs based on experience would not be sufficient to establish the legitimacy of such a use, yet it is necessary to show how these concepts can refer to objects which they do not find in any experience. The explanation of the manner in which such concepts can a priori refer to objects I call the Transcendental Deduction. Okay. I'm gonna pause. Get my orange highlighter again. Okay. The explanation of the manner in which such concepts can a priori refer to objects. Such concepts can a priori refer to objects. So to what extent excuse me, can an a priori concept refer to an object? So an a priori concept, something we know separate and apart from experience, or a concept that we grasp separate and apart from experience, whether that can actually a priori before experience refer to an object. Like, is there some link there? Okay. And I distinguish from it the empirical deduction, which shows the manner in which a concept is acquired through experience and through reflection upon experience, and which therefore concerns not the legitimacy of the concept, but only the fact through which we came to possess it. Okay. It's kind of like I was talking about sometime, when it's like, I think Kant uses like the idea of a house falling down, like a poorly built house falling down, and it's like, we don't have to experience the house falling down to know it's going to fall down because it's so poorly built. And that's not necessarily like an a priori understanding. It's kind of like idea. It's kind of like you're using your previous experience, empirical experience, to kind of just game out what is actually going to happen here. And that's not really what he's getting at, once again. We already have two totally distinct kinds of concepts, which nevertheless agree in this, that they both refer completely a priori to objects, namely the concepts of space and time as forms of sensibility. Yes, they both refer completely a priori to concepts. Okay. And the categories as concepts of the understanding. Okay, we already have two totally distinct kinds of concepts which nevertheless agree in this, that they both refer completely a priori to objects, namely the concepts of space and time, as forms of the sensibility, and the categories as concepts of the understanding. It would be labor lost to attempt an empirical deduction of either of these kinds of concepts, for their distinguishing characteristic is precisely the fact that they refer to their objects, without having borrowed anything from experience in order to represent them. This is the transcendental aesthetic, it's the whole point. If therefore a deduction of these concepts is necessary, it can only be transcendental. We can, however, for these concepts, as well as for all knowledge, try to discover in experience, if not the principle of their possibility, then at least the occasioning causes of their production. The impressions of the senses give us the additional impulse to open the whole power of knowledge with respect to them, and thus to produce experience. I'm going to reread that. Okay. The impression of the senses give us the initial impulse to open up the whole power of knowledge with respect to them, meaning to the senses, and thus to produce experience. Experience contains two heterogeneous elements, namely a matter for knowledge. Sorry. I thought I had an epiphany as to how to pronounce it. Isn't it sui juris? Isn't it? I don't know. I should know that as an attorney. Experience contains two very heterogeneous elements, namely a matter for knowledge derived from the senses and a certain form according to which this matter is arranged. Okay? Derived from the inner source of pure intuition and pure thought, which, on the occasion of the impressions of the senses, are first brought into action and produce concepts. Such an investigation of the first efforts of our faculty of knowledge, beginning with single perceptions and rising to general concepts, is no doubt very useful, and we have to thank the famous Locke for having been the first to open the way to it. A deduction of the pure a priori concepts, however, is quite impossible in this way. It lies in a different direction, because with reference to their future use, which is to be entirely independent of experience, they are required to show a very different certificate of birth than that of descent from experiences. Okay, I gotta take a minute. Okay, so he's talking about experience contains matter and form, and then we use it's arranged so we can, get thoughts from that. But that's like effectively thought through experience, and Kant is kind of coming at it the other way, which is why he's saying we can't do it that way, because he wants to know kind of what a priori, like what without experience are we able to know about how we process experience into the understanding and then the resulting judgments that come about. Okay, I think that kind of makes sense. If that's right, that kind of makes sense to me. Okay. Since this attempted physiological deviation concerns the questionum facti, contains a questionum facti, it cannot properly be called deduction, and hence we may call it the explanation of the possession of pure knowledge. Right. It's factual. It's like what we actually experience, as opposed to like the right we have within us. The right is kind of the word he uses, but like the the right or ability we have to process this stuff. Like what a priori do we know about that? Can we know about that? I think if I just say a priori enough, I must be must be right about something eventually. It's kind of what it feels like. It is clear, therefore, that the possible deduction of this pure knowledge can only be a transcendental and not empirical one. That makes sense. And that any attempt at an empirical deduction of the pure a priori concepts is simply a waste of time. Attempts, isn't it kind of a paradox? I don't know. Attempts which no one would think of except those who have never understood the very peculiar nature of this kind of knowledge. But although it may be admitted that the only possible kind of deduction of pure a priori knowledge must be along the transcendental line, it is not thereby clear that such a deduction is absolutely necessary. We have earlier, by means of a transcendental deduction, traced the concepts of space and time to the very sources, and explained and determined their a priori objective validity, transcendental aesthetic. Geometry, however, strides confidently through all kinds of a priori knowledge without having to ask philosophy for a certificate of the pure and legitimate descent of its fundamental concept of space. But it should be remarked that in geometry this concept is used only with reference to the external world of sense and space, is the pure form of the intuition of that world. A world, therefore, in which all geometrical knowledge, being based on a priori intuition, possesses immediate evidence. Right. And in geometry, you can just live in that world where we just kind of create what it is. And we don't have to necessarily eventually deal with it actually existing that way in the real world, at least separate and apart as to how it exists in our mind. Right? Because we can just figure out the rules and then sure, we can confirm that it exists in the world that way, but it's not the same as, like, chair. You know what I mean? Or, like, fate, or the soul, or stuff like that. Where it's like, okay, we can't prove this stuff a priori and then, like, kind of fact-check it on the other end, like you can in geometry. Okay. But geometry... But it should be remarked that in geometry, this concept is used only with reference to the external world of sense, and space is the pure form of the intuition of that world. A world, therefore, in which all geometrical knowledge, being based on a priori intuition, possesses immediate evidence, and through knowledge itself, the objects are given a priori in intuition as far as their form is concerned. Okay, I think that's kind of what I was saying, I hope. With the pure concepts of the understanding, however, there originates the inevitable demand for a transcendental deduction, not only of these concepts themselves, but also of space. For since they speak of objects not through predicates of intuition and sensibility, but through those of pure a priori thought, they refer to objects generally, that is, apart from all conditions of sensibility. And as they are not based on experience, they cannot exhibit in a priori intuition any object on which they would, prior to all experience, have based their synthesis. Sorry, I have to text my wife back. Okay, I'm going to reread that. Sorry. With the pure concepts of the understanding, however, there originates the inevitable demand to look for a transcendental deduction, not only for these concepts themselves, but also of space. For since they speak of objects not through predicates of intuition and sensibility, but through those of pure a priori thought, they refer to objects generally, that is, apart from all conditions of sensibility. And I think this is what, kind of what I was saying, like, you can't really do that with chair or, keyboard, stuff that actually exists. Like, you can't really, the way you can with geometry, you can't really, like totally a priori just refer to keyboards generally. I don't know. It's not something you can game out before experience. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing the point. And as they are not based on experience, they cannot exhibit in a priori intuition any object on which they would, prior to all experience, have based their synthesis. Okay? These pure concepts of the understanding, therefore, not only excite suspicion with regard to the objective validity and the limits of their use, but they also render ambiguous the concept of space, because of their inclination to use it beyond the conditions of sensible intuition. These pure concepts of the understanding, therefore, not only excite suspicion with regard to the objective validity and limits of their use. Okay, that makes sense. We're not able to use it a lot, maybe only with stuff like geometry, at least at first blush. But they also render ambiguous the concept of space, because of their inclination to use it beyond the conditions of sensible intuition. And this indeed, I'm just going to keep going. I'm not 100% sure I understand that. And this indeed was the very reason why we found a transcendental deduction of it, such as we gave before, necessary. Before the reader has taken a single step in the field of pure reason, he must be convinced of the inevitable necessity of such a transcendental deduction. Otherwise, he would walk... Oh, God. I'm starting to worry I missed the whole point. Otherwise, he would walk on blindly, and, after having strayed in every direction, would have to return to the same ignorance in which he started. He must at the same time perceive in advance the inevitable difficulty of such a deduction, so that he may not complain about obscurity, when the matter itself is deeply veiled, or become weary too soon of our removal of obstacles. For we must either altogether surrender all claims to insights of pure reason as our favorite field, because it extends beyond limits of all possible experience, or else must bring this critical inquiry to completion. Okay. They're out of my yogurts at the store. It's very upsetting. I have these Siggies. It's in a purple package. It's like low sugar. It's like 0 sugar, I think. Vanilla. Yogurts. It's perfect. It's my perfect yogurt. I've probably eaten 1,000 of them. I've probably eaten more than that. I've had like 1 to 2 a day for easily 2 to 3 years. And then maybe some before that. It's like not, it's like sweet, but it's not too sweet. And it's also not too, I don't like the super sour yogurts. To me, yeah, it's absolutely perfect. Oh, but I could be the only ones to eat them. Anyway. Above, we had but little difficulty in showing how the concepts of space and time, although they belong to a priori knowledge, must yet refer necessarily to objects, and how they make synthetic knowledge of them possible independently of all experience. For as no object can appear to us, that is, be an object of empirical intuition, except by means of pure forms of sensibility. Space and time are pure intuitions which contain a priori the conditions of the possibility of objects as appearances, and the synthesis of these intuitions possesses objective validity. And so I think he's saying, like, we did the transcendental aesthetic, and it was pretty obvious, like, that, like, how it worked. Like, you had to have space and time underlying everything, and then, everything existed in space and time, and then was, presented to the intuition and experienced. Whereas it might not be the same. I think what he's previewing is, at least just so I kind of understand, it might not be the same that we are presented with potential, ideas or concepts or experiences, and then the understanding, like, has to deliver them to us and synthesize them in a specific way that we could understand the form of a priori. Like, maybe it's just that our understanding is like, who the fuck knows doing what with the information it's being given, and we can't necessarily know the a priori underpinnings of that. Whereas again, for experience, we kind of know space and time, like nothing sensible. The transcendental aesthetic shows us that space and time present everything to us through sensibility, through the underlying forms of space and time. But concepts and ideas, like, don't necessarily have the same underlying form that we can point to. And it's particularly hard because, like, there are a few things we have to do. Like, first of all, we would have to funnel all experience into that. So there's, like, an extra step in the transcendental deduction. And we'd also have to account for, like, ideas, things in our head that we think of, which are also valid to potentially produce concepts. Maybe not concepts, but judgments. So, like, yeah. There's an extra step for that, too. Like, an extra aspect of it. Okay. Getting out of breath. Talking about this. Okay. I'm going to reread that just to make sure I understand. Above, we had but little difficulty in showing how the concepts of space and time, although they belong to a priori knowledge, must yet refer necessarily to objects, and how they make synthetic knowledge of them possible independently of all experience. For as no object can appear to us, that is, be an object of empirical intuition, except by means of such pure forms of sensibility. Space and time are pure intuitions which contain a priori the conditions of the possibility of objects as appearances, and the synthesis in these intuitions possesses objective validity. All right. I'm with you, Kant. Got you. I think. The categories of the understanding, on the contrary, do not represent to us conditions under which the objects are given in intuition, and it is quite possible, therefore, that objects should appear to us without having to refer necessarily to the functions of the understanding, and without the understanding having to contain a priori the conditions of these objects. Okay, and effectively what he's saying is, like, just because, intuition works that way, doesn't, our understanding doesn't have to work that way. And maybe it doesn't. It can, something can be presented to us that is completely beyond the categories that Kant lays out. I think he's kind of conceding that here. Who the fuck knows? Like, I don't know. Like, I think he's kind of making the broader point of, like, there's no reason it has to be limited to those things, like things that are presented to our understanding. But also, I think he's saying that it also doesn't, just because the transcendental aesthetic works by having an underlying a priori form of space and time, it doesn't mean that the understanding functions the same way and has some sort of underlying form that is a priori that we can understand. I think Kant's going to come up with something. Spoiler alert, probably. I don't really know, so I can't spoil. I mean, I think he does. I don't know what it might be. Okay, that makes sense. There arises, therefore, a difficulty here, such as we did not meet with the field of sensibility, namely, how subjective conditions of thought can have objective validity, that is, become conditions of the possibility of knowledge, of all knowledge of objects. How the subjective conditions of thought can have objective validity, that is, become conditions of the possibility of all knowledge of objects. So subjective conditions of thought, meaning things funneled into our understanding or through our understanding. It's all subjective. Like, it can't be otherwise. But how do we know that there is, that, you know, what comes out the other side and or what is being fed into it is in some way objective? And kind of related to that, doesn't necessarily mean that there is something that underlies all knowledge of objects, so is what he says. So, like, it doesn't mean that there is some underlying form, like I said, that we can a priori know about objects before they are funneled into the understanding. Appearances can, indeed... Sorry. Appearances can, indeed, be given an intuition independently of the functions of the understanding. Yes. Let us take, for instance, the concept of cause, which implies a special kind of synthesis, whereby upon something, A, something totally different, B, is posited according to a rule. We cannot say that this is a priori clear, why appearances should contain something of this kind, for we cannot appeal to experiences as proof, because we have to be able to establish the objective validity of this a priori concept. Hold on, wait, what? Okay, so something totally different, B, is posited according to a rule. Cause, okay. We cannot say that it is a priori clear why appearances should contain something of this kind. Okay? For we cannot appeal to experiences as proof, because we have to be able to establish the objective validity of this a priori concept, right? So in order to establish cause, this is what Hume, like, drove Hume crazy, I think. We want to be able to a priori say, like, every cause has an effect, or, like, causes result in effects. But we can't, like, it is no argument to say, like, every time that I have seen a cause, there's been an effect. That's merely correlation and not causation. And Kant's saying, like, we need something a priori to explain why that is the case. We can't just rely on our experience of it. It would remain, therefore, a priori doubtful whether such a concept could not perhaps It would remain, therefore, a priori doubtful whether such a concept be not perhaps altogether empty, and be without any corresponding object at all among appearances. Maybe it doesn't exist, maybe we can't know it, especially a priori. This is different with objects of sensible intuition. It is evident that they must conform to the formal conditions of sensibility existing a priori in the mind, because otherwise they would not be objects for us. But that they must also conform to the conditions which the understanding requires for the synthetic unity of thought does not seem to follow quite so obviously. But that they must also conform to the conditions which the understanding requires for the synthetic unity of thought. Okay, yeah. Does not seem to quite follow quite so obviously. For appearances might well be so constituted that the understanding should not find them to be conforming to the condition of its unity. For appearances might well be so constituted that the understanding should not find them to be conforming to the condition of its unity. So it's possible that appearances, we find out, are not actually conforming to what we synthesize it into. And all might then be in such confusion that, for instance, nothing would present itself in the succession of appearances which would supply a rule of synthesis and thus correspond to the concept of cause and effect, so that this concept would then be quite empty, null, and meaningless. Okay. I think I get it. Appearances would nonetheless offer objects to our intuition, because intuition does not in any way require the functions of thought. We might consider escaping from these troublesome inquiries by saying that experience continually offers examples of such irregularity among appearances, and so gives us sufficient opportunity to abstract from them the concept of cause, and hence to verify at the same time the objective validity of such a concept. But in that case, we would be overlooking the fact that the concept of cause sorry. But in that case, we would be overlooking the fact that the concept of cause cannot possibly arise in that way, as we kind of talked about before, and that it must either be founded completely a priori in the understanding, or must be given up altogether as a mere hallucination. Hume. For this concept strictly requires that something, A, should be of such a nature that something else, B, follows from it necessarily, and according to an absolutely universal rule. I think universal rule is going to be like Kant's escape hatch. Like, if we can find stuff that applies to concepts that we can apply 100% of the time. I mean, that is one of the ways that, when Kant was describing a priori, it's like something that's necessary. Because if it applies to all things that might exist that are funneled through the understanding, then it must be a priori, something we could say a priori. So I think that's what Kant is going to look for. For this concept strictly requires that something, A, should be of such a nature that something else, B, follows from it necessarily, and, in bold letters, according to an absolutely universal rule, period. Appearances no doubt supply us with cases from which we can obtain a rule according to which something usually happens, but never a rule according to which the result is necessary. Right, and that's like experience, as he talked about in the beginning of the book. This is why there is a dignity attached to the synthesis of cause and effect, which cannot be expressed empirically, namely, that the effect is not only an addition to the cause, but is posited through it, and springs from it. Nor is the strict universality of the rule ever a property of empirical rules. By means of induction they can acquire none but comparative universality, that is, extensive applicability. If we were to treat the pure concepts of the understanding as merely empirical products, we would completely change our use of them. Amen. Okay, section 14. Transition to the transcendental deduction of the categories. Only two cases are possible in which synthetic representation and its objects can agree, can refer to each other with necessity, and can, as it were, meet each other. So synthetic representation and its objects. So like synthesis and its objects. So objects that are presented to me in the world and how my brain synthesizes them through the understanding. There's only... Sorry, I'm just going to read it again. Because it's important I repeat this for me. Only two cases are possible in which synthetic representation and its objects can agree, can refer to each other with necessity, and can, as it were, meet each other. Either if the object alone makes the representation possible, if the object alone makes the representation possible. That means it's necessary. Okay. But that's kind of not the thing we're interested in, because that's just experience. Or if the representation alone makes the object possible. In the former case, the relation is only empirical, and the representation is never possible a priori. This applies to appearances with regard to whatever in them belongs to sensation. In the latter case, where the representation alone makes the object possible, in the latter case, though representation by itself, for we do not speak here at all of its causality by means of the will, does not produce its object so far as its existence is concerned, nevertheless, the representation is a priori determinant of the object if through it alone it is possible to know anything as an object. Interesting. Okay, so what he's saying is sure, I can't think of a computer and have a computer appear or exist. Certainly not in the same way that I could experience a computer and therefore understand that a computer exists. But if it is only possible for me to understand that a computer exists by having within me the representation of a computer, then it's almost like that's like the a priori, I don't know, kind of that is almost as necessary for the existence of the computer as, and maybe a computer is a bad example, as for the existence of the computer, meaning if I was presented with something and I just had no ability to synthesize it or understand what the fuck it was, then you could say that my ability to synthesize it and understand it and know what it is as essential to its existence as it actually existing and being presented to me. It's pretty interesting. It's completely fucking genius, but it's a little circular. Let's check out what's going on with the Senate. Do we have a predict it? Let's see. I know people. I mentioned betting markets related to some election stuff, and people in chat, the chat I was in, were like, "Dude, betting markets are you shouldn't be able to bet on politics. It's crazy." I don't disagree with that, but as far as an indicator of what the fuck is happening, yeah, it's kind of helpful. Senate to pass reconciliation. 71 cents is at the 50. It's 50-50. And Vance puts on his eyeliner, slicks back his hair, breaks the tie. Interesting. Okay. All right, back to more important stuff. In the latter case, though representation by itself, for we do not speak here at all of its causality by means of the will, does not produce its object so far as its existence is concerned, nevertheless the representation is a priori determinant of the object, if through it alone it is possible to know anything as an object. And maybe it's like a little more broad than like a computer example, like just having the ability to synthesize and know things as objects is sufficient. And maybe a specific example makes it seem kind of silly. Maybe I'm just not smart enough to explain it very well. Pretty good though. There are two conditions, then, under which alone knowledge of an object is possible. Firstly, intuition, through which the object is given, though only as an appearance. Secondly, concept, through which an object is thought that corresponds to this intuition. Interesting. Sorry, I want to highlight this stuff. From what we have said before, it is clear that the first condition, namely, that under which alone objects can be intuited, does in fact underlie, as far as their form is concerned, the objects a priori in the mind. All appearances, therefore, necessarily conform to this formal condition of sensibility, because only through it can they appear, that is, be empirically intuited and given. Now the question arises whether concepts are not also a priori antecedent conditions under which alone something can be, if not intuited, then nonetheless thought as object in general. Okay? For in that case, all empirical knowledge of objects would necessarily conform to such concepts, because without presupposing them, nothing is possible as object of experience. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Good work, Kant. Smart. Well, that's depressing. Okay. All experience also contains, besides the intuition of the senses through which something is given, a concept of an object which is given in intuition, or which it appears to be. Okay. All experience also contains, besides the intuition of the senses through which something is given, a concept of an object which is given in intuition, or which appears in it. Concepts of objects in general thus underlie all empirical knowledge as its a priori conditions. And the objective validity of the categories as a priori concepts rests on this very fact that through them alone experience is possible, as far as the form of thought is concerned. If only by means of them any object of experience can be thought at all, it follows that they refer to objects of experience necessarily and a priori. Okay, the transcendental deduction of all a priori concepts has thus a principle to which our whole investigation must be directed, namely the principle that these concepts must be recognized as a priori conditions of the possibility of experiences. These concepts must be recognized as a priori conditions of the possibility of experiences, whether the possibility of the intuition, which is found in experience, or the possibility of thought. Concepts which form the objective ground of the possibility of experience are for this very reason necessary. Okay. Got it. To unfold the experience wherein they are found, however, would not amount to a deduction, but a mere illustration, because they would otherwise be only contingent. Without their original reference to possible experience, in which all objects of knowledge occur, their reference to any one object would be quite incomprehensible. Right. Locke, for want of this reflection, and because he met with pure concepts of the understanding and experience, also derived them from experience. Right. So effectively, Kant is like taking the other way, right? Like, he's getting his concepts of things like, again, like there's one way to get a concept of a computer, and it's just strictly from experiencing a computer. But what Kant is saying is, like, if you take it from the other end, like, you can't have the concept of a computer unless you have the ability to have the concept of a computer. And therefore, like, since it is necessary for you to have an experience of a computer, like, you can't have one without the other. Locke only focused on the experience side of that and didn't focus at all on the knowledge side of that, or understanding side of that. Okay. Sorry, I have the likelihood that the reconciliation bill is going to pass up on my screen, and I just keep looking up and sighing really heavily. Okay. Locke, for want of this reflection, and because he met with pure concepts of the understanding and experience, also derived them from experience, and yet proceeded so inconsistently that he attempted to use them for knowledge, which goes far beyond all limits of experience. David Hume realized that, in order to be able to do this, these concepts must have their origin a priori. But as he could not explain how it is possible that the understanding must think concepts which in themselves are not combined in the understanding, as nevertheless necessarily combined in the object, and as it never occurred to him that possibly the understanding itself might, through these concepts, be the author of that experience in which its objects are found, he was constrained to derive them from experience, namely, from a subjective necessity that arises through frequent association and experience, and which in the end is mistakenly supposed to be objective, that is, from habit. But he proceeded very consistently, declaring it to be impossible with these concepts, or with the principles arising from them, to go beyond the limits of experience. The empirical derivation, however, which was adopted by both philosophers, cannot be reconciled with the scientific a priori knowledge which we actually have, namely the knowledge in pure mathematics and general natural science, and is therefore refuted by this fact. Right, synthetic a priori knowledge exists. Okay. The former of these two celebrated men, Locke, opened the door wide to fantastic extravagance, because reason, once it has gained such rights, can no longer be checked by vague recommendations to moderation. The other, thinking that he had discovered so universal an illusion of our faculty of knowledge, which had formerly been accepted as reason, handed himself over entirely to skepticism. We now intend to find out whether it may not be possible to find for human reason a safe passage between these two rocks, to assign to it definite limits, and yet to keep open for it the entire field of its purposive activities. But first I shall give an explanation of the categories. They are concepts of an object in general, by means of which the intuition of an object is regarded as determined with respect to one of the logical functions in judgment. Okay, so the logical tables. So we have an intuition, it goes to one of the logical functions in the table. Thus the function of the categorical judgment was that of the relation of the subject to the predicate. For instance, all bodies are divisible. Here, however, with reference to the merely logical use of the understanding, it remained undetermined which of the two concepts, the function of the subject or of the predicate, was to be assigned. For we could also say something divisible is a body. But if I bring the concept of body under the category of substance, it is thereby determined that its empirical intuition and experience must always be considered as subject, and never as mere predicate. The same applies to all other categories. Okay, I'm not 100% sure I follow that, but okay. Pretty good setup. And so next we have the Transcendental Deduction proper. And there's two different versions of it, A and a B version. My book, annoyingly, effectively cuts the page in half horizontally. It has the A version on the top and a B version on the bottom. I don't know why you would do that as opposed to just putting the A version and being like, this is the A version, and like filling up the pages and then saying this is the B version, putting that there, but whatever. Anyway, that's what we'll do next.